Welcome to the Unit Economics Podcast. I'm Josh Stabinsky. On today's episode, I sit down with Tenley Fitzgerald, the creator of Yes Apples, a consumer brand built to bring clarity and differentiation to the apple category. If you've ever walked into the grocery store and felt overwhelmed by the number of apple varieties in front of you, that's exactly the problem Tenley is trying to solve. Yes Apples is built around making the category easier to navigate, using branding and packaging to help consumers make more informed decisions at shelf. In this conversation, we get into how apples are actually sourced and sold at scale, how the business works across retail and direct-to-consumer, and what it looks like to build a brand in a category where most products are still treated as commodities. I learned a lot during my conversation with Tenley, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Tenley, thank you so much for taking the time to do this today. If you wouldn't mind just starting with a brief background on yourself, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure to be here. My whole background is in food. I've been basically food obsessed my entire life. My dad was in the apple industry. He was in peaches, he was in onions, but primarily the apple industry my entire life. And so I grew up going to trade shows. On my 18th birthday, I lobbied with him on Capitol Hill for migrant workers' rights. So I just sort of had this innate desire to be in the food industry, and then paired with what I experienced through kind of shadowing my dad for many years. It led me to study food marketing at Cornell University. And I basically took all of the electives that I could in the hotel school. So I got a nice mix of sort of hospitality and looking at business through that lens as well. And then every job that I've ever held has been in food, whether working in a cafe or working in produce and marketing at Fresh Direct, going on to Blue Apron, and then ultimately landing at Yes Apples. It's just been a fun time being a part of the category and then seeing like the mass evolution of it over the past 15 years.
Is food marketing a major that you created yourself? Did you design that, or is that a formal major that Cornell offers?
Yeah, it is a formal major. The time it was called Food Industry Management. And also at the time, I'm not sure what the stats are right now, but there were about like 5 programs nationally. I think now it's a little bit more easily accessible. I know NYU has a really great program, but it was marketing. It was a business degree. It was within the business school, but it was highly focused on the food industry. And one very cool aspect of the curriculum was the opportunity to become a food fellow. And I was a food fellow and got to take specific classes that were only offered to the food fellows. I had to do specific coursework. And then we also took a big international trip to look at an industry outside of the US. So my year went to Shanghai, China, and we got to visit a pork plant and Lay's, Frito, China, and Tesco, and all these different organizations that, had different roles in the food industry. And so got to learn a lot about sort of what the global food industry looked like as well.
What an incredible thing to get to study. I feel like I messed up. I should have studied food. I should have studied food marketing. I'm really interested to hear about the weeks and months leading up to, I guess, the formation of Yes Apples and like what that specific time in your life looked like, because it wasn't Yes Apples at the time you joined what would become
Correct.
Yes Apples. So walk me through what that looked like.
Yeah. So I had actually started working for New York Apple Sales, which is the parent company of Yes Apples, while I was still at Blue Apron. And I just always kind of had a few side hustles going on when I lived in New York City. And I had a connection to Kari Stannard, the owner of New York Apple Sales, because of the relationship with my dad. And she was just looking for somebody to help with social media. So I launched social media for the organization. And because my entire background is in consumer marketing, I quickly realized that there wasn't an opportunity to speak to consumers through the current business format as it was then. And so I kind of, started out on this journey, was posting and, made a handle that said like cooking with apples from New York, and really just started trying to inspire people through different recipes that were apples, and kind of started this path of trying to expand the consumer's mind of what apples can be used for. I think at a very high level, consumers know that they're versatile, but they don't think of them in the way that we think of, like, I don't know, avocados or nuts or all these different commodity items. They sort of go to apples for snacks, for pie, for applesauce, and that's typically where it kind of ends, and they can be used in so many different ways. So that was sort of the genesis of, like, how can I make apples cooler and get in this like social food zeitgeist? Very quickly, I determined that we didn't have a brand to be able to speak to this. I think historically speaking, Apple innovation has really only looked like adding more apples to the category, which has created just an oversaturation of varieties and as a result, confusion for the consumers. And so we'll talk about this more, but we've really seen over the past few years apple consumption decline. And it's not because people don't love apples or think they're great, but it's because they get to the shelf and they're just overwhelmed with all of the choices and there aren't good cues to help them make that decision. And so back up about, 7 or 8 years ago, I sort of saw this in its very infant form and wanted to do something about it. So I hired sort of a group of freelancers. I hired somebody to help me with naming. I hired a designer for like the actual design, not necessarily the packaging system. And I hired a brand consultant to help me sort of create some vision and mission for the brand, interview key stakeholders, and create Yes Apples.
What other consumer facing brands were you drawing inspiration from at this time? Because I think that the topic of branding produce is fascinating and I've seen it done really well, but there aren't that many examples I can actually think of. So I'm curious who you were drawing inspiration from at that point.
At that point, it was more limited than it is today. I was looking at a couple different categories. One I would call legacy categories. So Driscoll berries, Chiquita banana, sun-kissed oranges, cutie clementines. Those were sort of like the big names that had been around for decades at this point. Maybe with the exception of cuties, they were sort of newer to the space. The other category that I really looked to and was most inspired by actually was the lettuce category. 50 years ago, you went into the grocery store and you saw a head of iceberg lettuce. And then, now look at it, it's like an entire wall in every supermarket. There's a zillion different brands. There's salad kits. Like it just went bananas. And I felt like if lettuce can do it, like apples can do it. The one key difference that I want to mention in the examples of like berries, bananas, citrus is that something that Apple sort of has working for and against us is that we have so many varieties. If you have a clear display and a clear set of different types of varieties, some premium, some classic, but not too much overlap, I think that you can have a lot of varieties and still sell really well. In all of these other examples, Driscoll, Sunkist, Chiquita, they basically were selling one product. Like they're selling just bananas, they're selling just oranges. And yes, Driscoll has, blackberries, blueberries, strawberries, raspberries, but it's just one option for all of those different fruits. And so it was really taking these examples, but then having to be a little bit more critical about how do we apply it to many different varieties, have this like umbrella brand, this overarching brand, but think about how we can create a system of packaging, which is part of the rebrand today, to really help guide consumers and have them feel more educated and empowered when they're at shelf and there's, 10 plus varieties sitting in front of them. What are some of the cues that we can take from these single item brands and apply that to Guess Apples?
I'm really excited to talk about the rebrand, but before we get there, because I feel like we could spend half an hour just on the rebrand, I'm curious about what the reception in the market looked like immediately after launching the Yes Apples brand. My naive assumption is that both those in the supply chain and the actual end consumer were both exposed to the brand at this point. Was the reception what you were hoping for? Did you see some sort of spike in sales? Like, yeah, what did it look like to actually launch the brand? I guess is what I'm getting at.
It was not what you would expect. It was pretty tough to start, and I think that there's very clear reasons why. One, we officially launched in June 2020 when the whole world was operating in a way that they had never operated before. So, like, not a great time to try and flip a category and get them to do something different. What was also tough is that because the team, the like sales team, the internal team that are my partners and, within the organization had sort of been doing business for the same way for 15, 20 years, me introducing this idea of doing it very differently, there was a big learning curve there. They had done an excellent job being, partners to our growers, being really great suppliers to our retailers. It was a very well-oiled machine, but it was very transactional, very, I have apples for you today and I will get them to you by next week. And, this is sort of the system that we're working with. I basically came in and said, I think we should do this differently. I think we have more to sell here. I think we can be a strategic partner, not just a supplier. And really getting them to, one, believe and agree with what I was saying, but two, being able to translate that to the retailer didn't go smoothly in the beginning. To nobody's fault. It just was something that they weren't used to selling, and it was a very different shift of the business. Also, because they had been on the supply side for so long and that was their sort of bread and butter, they really respected the retailer and sort of saw the retailer as the key decision maker. Whereas I think a lot of companies that are creating new products, they're coming to the market with a perspective and saying, like, I have something new and you need it. And they're telling the retailer why they need it. And that was a very different way than the team was used to interacting and communicating with the retailer. It was much more like the retailer is the king. We're just here to like do what the retailer needs and sort of be that like trusty sidekick, trusty partner for them. And so again, when you're doing something differently and you're trying to command this like, I know what I'm doing. I have a solution for you. I want to be here to help you. It's a very different way of presenting to a retailer if you're not used to it. We also were asking retailers, like, what do you think? Like, how do you like this? And again, initially at the beginning, like, it didn't go well because so many of our retailer partners are private label. So they looked at us coming onto the scene with a consumer facing brand as either a disruption to their private label set or as like one more thing they needed to sell. We didn't do a great job at the beginning framing it as a solution, saying like, let us use all of our marketing tools. Let us help drive consumers into your store. Let us tell this story. Let us give credit to the growers who are growing these apples. Help us empower, consumers. This will actually make your set look streamlined. There'll be a system to it. It'll actually help you sell more apples. They just saw it as like one more thing. And so it took a long time to sort of figure out that miscommunication and how we needed to reframe the conversation so that they saw us as a value add, not something that was going to deter, the business or consumers even more. So there were a lot of learnings in those beginning years, and it's taken a long time. I would say that we're still not fully out of it. It's taken a long time to reframe it, get the right talking points in place, build a new brand with like a systematic, approach to sort of get us out of those first few years and sort of the missteps that we made during that time.
So I think this is a great time then to bring up the rebrand. Talk to me about what the next several years looked like and what led you to say, okay, it's actually time to sort of relaunch this brand with updated packaging, with updated design elements. What was going on and why was that the solution?
Yeah. So when we built Yes Apples to begin with, it was me leading these freelancers that I mentioned and sort of taking as much information that I could from other products that I was seeing in this space, but I didn't have a good sort of North Star in produce. And so it was a lot of just best guesses, I would say, trying to look at other categories and glean what I could. And then I worked with a designer that wasn't like a packaging designer. She was just a designer. And she did, again, an incredible job with her sort of scope of work and me being her guide. Over this time, I've gotten so much more customer data, which was one of the key pieces that was missing in the beginning. and understanding what their frustrations are with the category. And that's where so much of the rebrand has been informed. I now understand when consumers are going into the store what they want answered first about their apples, what sort of attributes of the apples are important to them, what other fruits and snacks are they eating and choosing over apples. We just asked so many more critical questions through consumer research that helped inform where we are today. And I didn't have any of that when we first started. And so in the past couple of years, I actually went out on maternity leave. And when I came back from that sort of step away from the business, I had this sort of aha moment where I was like, you know what? We are not doing the best that we can do right now. We're not answering these questions for consumers, and we need to do better. And so to me, that was really tightening this brand, which had grown love and followers and community over the years, but we needed to make it stronger, particularly because there is so much going on in the CPG space. And you've interviewed so many of the greats already. You know that there's constantly new innovation, new products. And so a big piece of this was if apples are trying to compete not only with other fruit, but also just the snack category in general, and all of those companies are really leveling up their brand and marketing game, that expectation doesn't go away for a consumer when they hit the produce aisle. If they're seeing all of this happening in the other areas of the store and then they get to the apple counter and it's just a vast sea of apples, they're sort of like, what is going on? Like, why do I know so much about better for you beverage, but I know nothing about apples? And so I really wanted to be able to compete in a stronger, smarter way with the rest of these categories, outside of the produce industry. And so I looked for several agencies. I was mostly looking at agencies that did not have anything to do with produce. I wanted somebody who was a true consumer brand agency that was thinking about things very differently than how produce is thinking about it. There were a couple agencies that I chatted with that had some food experience, but honestly, I looked so far outside of that realm because of everything that I just mentioned. I wanted to apply something very different to the category. And so I ended up finding Blur Bureau. They have offices in New York and Melbourne, and they just did an exceptional job. And it was through really strong strategic questions that the two of us were asking each other that got us to build this system that feels both nostalgic but modern. It brings excitement and color and joy to the category, but it also is helping consumers make a stronger, better decision for themselves. And it just feels like the unlock of what I've been trying to build over the past 6 years, like finally come to fruition and feel like a real brand. So it's been an excellent experience thus far. And I think we're only getting started.
It is some of the best visual branding I've seen in a long time, and I don't say that lightly. It was
Thank
so well
you.
executed, and I'm gonna show some visuals for viewers, and I highly recommend those who are listening to go check out what what the rebrand looks like. It is so well done. I'm curious now that you're live, what were the design elements that you introduced specifically to help alleviate these pain points that you were seeing in the data or hearing in the data? And do you have any early signal around whether or not it's working?
Yeah. So, first, for the design side, I've mentioned this a few times now, so apologies for the repetition, but it was really not about making new, beautiful packaging. It was really about making a system that helped customers learn more and be able to choose what they wanted to at shelf. And so we looked at other categories and looked at how other products that have multiple iterations of a product, how they sort of formatted that and made it a system. And so one example that we looked at a lot was actually Goodles, the macaroni and cheese, because they have many different flavors. There's vegan, there's parm, there's cheddar, there's all these different types. And for each different variety of their product, it's a different color box. The logo is the same, the pictures are similar. Like there were all these sort of standard elements to the design, but the actual box, it changed itself. And so we were thinking about, okay, at any given time, we can have 10 plus varieties on the shelf. Sort of like the average number of varieties is 12 to 15 in your sort of everyday big footprint grocery store. How can we make a system of packaging that doesn't feel overwhelming? It feels, cohesive and helpful, but also is joyous and fun and brings this excitement to the category. And so Blur did a really great job at choosing a color palette that on the surface looks very bright and in your face, but is actually pulled from when you look at like an orchard vista, the colors that you see in that vista are the colors that became the palette. So like you have apple white that's like the flesh of the apple. You have the apple red that's the skin. The yellow color that seems like how is this in the apple category is actually like when you look at where the stem comes from on an apple, there's oftentimes a little yellowing in that space, and that's where that yellow was pulled from. The green of the trees, the blue of the sky, all these things. And so it really created this palette that felt very different for apples because most of the time, for some strange reason, most apples lean into the red color, even though the actual apple itself is also red. So you're just like seeing a sea of red. So these are very different colors comparatively, but it all makes sense once you think about sort of the origin of them. So it was really using color as a way to differentiate the different varieties. And then beyond that, we learned through consumer research that really customers, which makes total sense, they want to know, am I going to like this variety? Some people like a softer bite. Some people like really hard, like break your tooth bite. Some people like sweet. Some people like tart. And because there are so many different varieties, it can be hard to know which one's which if you don't have the cues. So Blur created on the front of pack sort of these 3 stickers that were a play on the PLU sticker, which is, a shape and a piece of the Apple experience that you see all the time. And they created these 3 stickers. And initially they were sort of like flowery, fun, very descriptive. And then I sort of took a step back and said, how do we actually make these work harder for us? And how do we make them work harder for the consumer? And so then I basically created a spectrum of adjectives that talked about taste, flavor, and crunch value, and basically created like a spectrum of adjectives that help the customer understand where each apple falls within this spectrum for these 3 attributes so that they know exactly what they're getting when they pick up each of these different varieties. On the back of pack, we talked about, here's what this apple is good for. Use it for baking, use it for snacks, use it for a cheese board, whatever the case may be, to not only help guide the decision making, but also, as I mentioned earlier, to really inspire different use cases for apples and getting them to think about apples in much different ways. And then the last piece was, we know the adage, an apple a day keeps the doctor away, but they haven't really said like what apples are good for. We just know that they're good for you. So again, through some consumer research, we understood that fiber benefits, hydration benefits, and antioxidants, specifically this one called quercetin that helps with like mood boosting, that these are the 3 that we have the biggest opportunity to talk about and sort of own as a variety. And so we put those right on front of pack as well, and wanted to make sure that people knew that not only is this a delicious, versatile snack, but it's also very good for you. And that actual learning was taken from the blueberries who back, 20, 30 years ago, really started to own antioxidants. And now, even when you do consumer research, you see that blueberries are always associated with antioxidants. And consumers don't know which antioxidants, they just know that it's a big part of this fruit. And so we wanted to basically, you know, take some of those learnings, see how we can build campaigns around the health benefit of apples, but also make sure it's a reminder that this is, a great option for you no matter what.
I'm particularly drawn to good examples of educating consumers on shelf, like on package. And I think it's
Yeah.
really hard to do. But again, I think you've done an excellent job of doing it. And it's so funny because as I'm thinking about this, as I'm listening to you, like I am sort of the problem you're trying to address. I only buy Honeycrisp apples because I know I like
Yeah.
them and I've been burned buying other apples and I didn't really like them as much. And so I've just stopped trying other apples. So
Yeah.
it's the kind of problem that I didn't even realize was a problem, which is the kind of problem I like enjoy talking about on the show.
Totally.
I'm really interested to hear more about D2C. In doing research, I came across a quote from you around the importance of the role that D2C plays for Yes Apples. And that was surprising to me. I've never once thought about buying fruit online. And so I'm curious why that's such an important channel for you and how you're thinking about growing that channel as well.
Yeah. A couple things. So to begin with, I had come from an almost exclusive D2C world when I started Yes Apples. So I'd been in Fresh Truck for 6 years. I'd been at Blue Apron for a year and a half. That was like all I knew was how to sell food online. And so for me, in the beginning, it sort of just felt like the natural step was okay, we sell these apples in store, but yes, we should sell them online as well. And one thing that I was so hungry for then and have only become more hungry for over the years was what D2C affords a brand in terms of consumer connection and consumer data. And because we have always been sort of pegged, rightfully so, as a supplier to retailers, we're not always getting that insight. And because it's mostly brick and mortar retailers, it's just a very different level of granularity that you can dig into with customer data. So it has become a really big piece of the business in terms of connecting to consumers, creating and owning the full experience, and then understanding what their purchasing behavior is, what they're looking for, what makes them tick, why do they keep coming back. So in sort of relation to our brick and mortar business, it is a tiny, tiny little piece of the revenue line, but it's still meaningful. And actually, I've worked with a couple sort of demand forecast peers that we have forecasted that it can become a significant part of the business. But what's so valuable is that it helps us to learn quickly what people like, how they describe flavor, what drives repeat purchase, how average order size changes, what seasonality, impact there is. And then it allows us to bring our customers into the broader ecosystem as well. Once they're through e-commerce, they enter our email and retention funnel. And so then it gives us the opportunity to keep connecting and educating them, to deepen that relationship. And in many cases, even drive them back to retail. This is when I talk about like being a strategic partner to our retail partners is, we have all of these marketing channels as a brand, so we can help drive that traffic into store and get them buying apples at the HEBs and Whole Foods and Walmarts and Sam's Clubs of the world because we have these own channels. And so that also helps us in some cases be a strengthening element to our retailer partnerships because we're showing what we're doing to support the sale of apples at their specific stores. And in some cases too, we've been able to develop and merchandise different boxes and sort of the assortment on Yes Apples. So we have a baking box. So it's 3 varieties that does change throughout the season based on what's available. We have a snacking box. We just launched our first box with non-Apple products that's called the Everyday Fuel Box, and consumers can choose either to add One Trick Pony peanut butter or pistachio butter to their box. Then they get 4 apples and a bag of Jamie's granola. So we're trying to also sort of diversify our offering to show this ecosystem of brand partners and how apples can play together in this CPG space as well. So we're adding a lot to the space. We're offering a different experience for sure than what you're getting in the retail space. And then we're just learning immense amounts from the customer data.
What is it going to take to grow that specific revenue line from something that's teeny tiny to something material?
Right now, the biggest thing actually getting in our way for growing the D2C is just the logistical and labor intensive elements of that part of the business. We work with 9 different packing facilities throughout the state of New York, and there are plenty of humans involved in that process, but a lot of it is also automated. And so we are washing apples, we're tumbling them, they're sort of being sorted into different packing formats. With our D2C business, at this point in time, it is all hand packed. like we're sifting through boxes of apples. We're picking out the diamonds of the apple bunch. So you're getting the absolute best quality. They're being hand packed into a box. They're being wrapped. They're being shipped. Like we're driving it to FedEx on the days that they don't pick up. So it's very labor intensive at the moment. So we have to be really careful about how much marketing we're turning on to make sure that we're not overdoing it. But there is a steady stream of demand. We've seen that grow year over year. This past year, we had an exceptional year of growth. We're also seeing growth in average order size. People, despite the higher prices, they're buying more than one product for the majority of the orders that we're getting. So people that have found us and found value in us, they're showing that with their spend. Beyond that, our return customer rate is 41%. So we're really hooking people once they come into the Yes Apples world. And so I think it's us really, getting to a bigger point to like prove the potential of the business and then really building out this sort of labor and logistics behind it to continue pushing it forward. This season, we also launched on Walmart.com, and I have my eye on so many additional e-commerce platforms, even outside of Yes Apples, that I'd really like us to get into. So I think as those doors start to open as well, we'll be able to really justify investing in the sort of labor piece of the D2C business.
I'm really interested in hearing about the supply side constraints. And so I'm thinking about listing your product on Walmart, and I'm thinking about what it would look like if there was a sudden demand shock and what would break down in your supply chain first. Because my understanding is that you're sourcing from around 50 farms. Is that correct?
Yeah,
All
that's
in New
correct.
York, which, goes without saying. What would it look like to scale from here? Are you just inherently capped on how big this can get? What would that
Yeah.
take? What would it look like?
So we had a little glimpse of this this fall. We had an article written about one particular variety called Rave, and she basically the headline was, "I found an apple better than Honeycrisp. It's called Rave, and you buy it at Yes Apples." And for us, it broke the internet because it was picked up by AOL, Apple News, and Yahoo, and we had a huge, massive spike in orders. And actually, we sold out of Rave and then had like triple the amount of orders that even came in after we had sold out of Rave. But it put a huge stress on the business in a good way. But it really pressure tested sort of what we're capable of. It was all hands on deck. Like it was just us pulling as many people as we could into this particular funnel and getting as many boxes out the door. And we did it. There were a few cases where we had to push customers out to the next week for fulfillment. So we were, open with them and emailed them and let them know. Everybody was super generous and, totally understanding. But it was this like, oh shit, this can happen to us. And how do we work to make it the best experience for the customer? And so we did get through that bump and we saw that huge spike in demand. It stayed at that level for a good 3 weeks. And then it was sort of into holiday season with gifting and baking and just the natural increase in Apple purchasing behavior during that time period anyway. So it really had this long tail for us. And so orders were really strong and really high for months after that bump. And so we did bring on another person. It's decreased slightly now that we're sort of out of that seasonal demand, but even with sort of people getting back to healthy eating in, the new year and a focus on fresh, it still has maintained above where we were before that bump. But again, as I sort of said earlier, like what e-commerce does for us is it allows us to bring people into the Yes Apples ecosystem. It gets us to potentially pitch to them like a subscription program where they're then buying apples every 2, 4, 6 weeks, and really gets them on the hook. And so something like that, we just kind of need a couple more of those, I think. And then we can talk about like, what does it look like automating this business? Or if we had a huge spike in, Walmart, we basically have done zero marketing with Walmart because we're afraid of what that could do to this little lean and mean team. So we've sort of held off for now until we feel like we can get enough of a well-oiled machine to sort of really push it on Walmart. But I think that's what it's going to take is a little bit of hurting, a little bit of being uncomfortable, a little bit of like breaking the system before we know that we can take it to the next level.
What does it look like to bring on another farm? What factors are you looking at if you were to go out and try to bring on another farm into your ecosystem? Just for scale, like, how many apple farms are there in New York? I have no idea. Like, how
Yeah.
much supply is actually out there? Like, and for those that you're working with currently, are you tapping, like, what percent, if you know offhand, like, what percent of their yield are you tapping into as a brand?
Yeah. It really depends. There's so many factors, but in general, there are about 1,500 apple growers in the state of New York. Out of the 1,500 apple growers across the state, we work with about 50 family farms. They range from anywhere from 3 to 8 generations of family farms. And for those of you who have not been to an apple orchard recently, like the homes of these families are in the center of the orchard. So they walk out of their homes every single day and they're surrounded by apple trees. It's what they know, it's what they eat, sleep, and breathe. Like it is their job to grow the best tasting apples for, all of these consumers' enjoyment. And so bringing on a farm can look different because sometimes it's just like an easy sign on. I mean, there's definitely requirements. You have to pass food safety. We do audits. We do audits on our packing facilities. So they have to be able to be within the standards that we hold our partners accountable to. But outside of that, if they're able to help sort of grow the pot and this aggregated system that we have, the more the merrier in a way. And they are partnering with us in so many different facets, certainly from the sales and marketing arm, but also in terms of crop planning. Because we're able to take data from both consumers and retailers, we sort of have an outlook on what are the varieties that should be sold, what are the trees that should be pulled out of the ground. It takes about 3 years from the planting of an apple tree until like proper fruit production. So there's a long game here. So you have to be really thoughtful about when you're pulling trees out, what you're replanting, because not only are you pulling out trees and replanting and spending the money on that new variety, you're also losing money because now that once producing orchard is no longer producing. So it can be like a very tenuous, stressful situation, especially for the smaller growers. And so we're helping with sort of outlook on that, technological advances, because we're sort of aggregating people not only for supply, we're also aggregating them for systems improvements and being able to have sort of bigger buying power, bigger share of voice. So it is a true partnership in every sense. And we are the biggest shipper of apples out of New York State. There are probably 5 or 6 other key competitors of ours in the state, but we have had this business going for over 100 years in several different forms. It's mostly been in the form that it is today for the past 25 to 30 years, but there's a really strong sort of rooted foundation of this organization within the New York apple industry.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's amazing to me time and time again on this show how I uncover how little I know about so many different things. There's a point you made earlier in our conversation that I want to make sure we touch on before we close things out. You mentioned the plateau or the decline of Apple sales over the last 20 or so years, and beyond consumer education, what is it going to take to reverse course?
Yeah. So there's actually a lot going on in the industry as we speak to address this issue. And, if you think about some of the other categories, blueberries, there's a pear organization, there's, potato commissions, there's all these sort of behind the scene organizations supporting these commodity crops. And they're all doing really good things in terms of making sure that all the different suppliers and growers of these products have the information that they need to go sort of best present themselves to retailers and consumers. So that's all really important, strong work. My hypothesis is changing the consumer understanding and behavior of the category. So I think, yes, consumer education is sort of the key unlock here. But I also think that talking to consumers in a way that they're used to being talked to by every other category in the store is the biggest opportunity.
I think we have time for one more question. Where do you see Yes Apples 3 to 5 years from now?
Everywhere. I mean, like, if I had my perfect world, we would have just like blanket displays in all these different retailer partners. You would find us in the dairy aisle, you would find us in the vinegar section, you would find us in frozen foods. Like, because of the versatility in apples, to me, the application of them in all of the different spaces in the grocery store, I just think it could go every which way. I think that there could be all these great opportunities for partnerships and expansion into other categories. I think the produce shelf is going to be actually the hardest sell because of private label working against us. But my goal is really to be able to hone in on two, or three key retailer relationships, have a proof of concept of what working with Yes Apples can provide, and then use those to help inform other partnerships with other retailers. I think that's what it's going to take. I've been trying to prove it through D2C data as much as possible, but we're going to need to be able to really show the movement of the needle with an in-store, brick and mortar retailer. And so hopefully we'll have, those wins in this next season so that we can grow over the seasons beyond that. So I just hope a lot more people see Yes Apples in the coming years.
Yeah, absolutely. Tenley, thank you so much for the time. If you want to share with listeners where they can find Yes Apples, please feel free to do so.
Always available at yesapples.com, walmart.com, and then big retailers like Costco, Walmart, Harris Teeter, HEB, and a lot of the brick and mortar retailers. You may not see our packaging yet. Hopefully this, September you will. So for now, look for like a little quick lock tag that has Yes Apples on it or the PLU sticker.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, let's debrief. What stood out to me about today's conversation is that it's not really about building a new product. It's about making an existing category easier to navigate. Apples haven't changed, but the way they're presented and understood at shelf hasn't kept up. And that's where most of the friction that Tenley saw lies. In a category like this, clarity is the product. If you can make it easier for someone to understand what they're buying and feel confident in that decision, you can change the way the category performs without changing the underlying product. I learned so much during my conversation with Tenley, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you haven't already, make sure to follow and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.